Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
We've been talking about conscious coordination and defects, how to find defects, and that defects are useful for us. So once you find defects, what is it we do? So how do we use instructions to change what the person is doing? How do we create a readjustment?
Yes, this is a central question in this technique because it's a technique that is based on giving instructions. So you start by receiving instructions from your teacher, and then you very quickly understand that you have to take his place, his role, and you have to, as a person wanting to employ the Alexander technique, you are going to give yourself instructions. And if you remember last week, we saw that Alexander was quite critical of the pupil receiving instructions and being capable of in fact using these instructions. Well, it's obvious that the person is first there to come to us to learn. So we cannot expect the person to understand and know how to use these instructions when the person starts. It would make no sense. Otherwise, it's not teaching that we are. Our job is to teach. Our job is to bring people from a position where they don't know how to use these instructions to create a conscious guidance to, well, a new development in their psychophysical organization, so that when I say psychophysical organization, I mean that you can start thinking some intentions, and of course, bringing these instruction into performance, into practice. That's the whole point. And the whole point is also to understand that whenever we start learning this technique, and I say whenever, it means that when you start the first day or when you start after 3,000 days or even more, you're still in a position to discover that, first of all, your capacity to obey instruction has still to be developed. So you're starting to develop when you start, but when you are a teacher, for example, I've been teaching the conscious guidance system for more than 20 years, and I'm still at the point where I need to, question my capacity to obey instructions that I'm giving myself in order to perform coordinated readjustments. So there is not a massive difference between the teacher and the student. The teacher is not someone that is above and the student below, and the teacher tries to bring the student to, mimic his fantastic capacity, his excellence. No way, this is not like this. So when the pupil comes, is going to hear instructions, whatever method you are going to go to, whether it is the modern Alexander technique or the initial Alexander technique as we both teach it, the student is going to hear instructions. So it's important to understand that these instructions are for learning to do. We want to learn to do, despite what my colleagues may say. We are to learn to, in fact, do anything in life while lengthening and widening the torso. If you see somebody that is shortening the torso, you could consider this is a defect in functioning, because you cannot shorten the torso and breathe openly. You cannot shorten the torso and be balanced or poised, as we say. So it's obvious that we are looking for the signs of shortening, the sign of compression of the torso, and we want to learn how to not reproduce these coordinations. There are correct coordinations and there are incorrect coordinations. So the teacher is going to notice that the students is directing the movement of certain parts in an incorrect way, which result in a position that we can fix, for example, on a picture, and we can start to realize how that part of the organism is in fact directed. But we do not direct parts, we direct the movements of the parts. That's a massive difference with the modern Alexander technique, because you will see the modern Alexander technique, they really do think of parts as parts of, or directing parts. And this is, you will see a massive difference with the teaching of conscious guidance and control. I have taken an example from a very old film from 1987, where one senior teacher, first generation teacher, is demonstrating his concept of readjustment. And he, as you will see, is in the part I've chosen, showing how he, the teacher, readjusts the shoulder of a pupil. And there is no explanation whatsoever as to how the pupil is going to readjust the shoulders by herself after the performance by the teacher has been done. Well, it is supposed that the concrete experience of having the shoulder moved by someone else in the correct, so-called correct position is going to give that person a definite advantage in order to use an instruction like we will see, widen the upper part of the arm. And I totally contest this view. I have seen so many Alexander teachers that have had the same readjustment of the shoulders, and I've never been in any way capable of organizing the coordination of the different parts of the torso and the mechanism of the arm in practice. So this idea that having the concrete experience of the part placed in position, for me, does not correspond to a correct concept. That's what I'm going to explain. So I'm going to start straight away with the difference between what I call a endgaining view and, well, of course, the means whereby view. And there is going to be first this demonstration of the endgaining view, as I understand it, when we will see this first generation teacher performing an adjustment for the pupil. And I've also taken a few images from my own practice, where you will see one student that is also working on readjusting the movement of the arm relatively to the movement of the torso during a conscious guidance and control session. So to start with, this idea of teaching method according to the endgaining or to the means whereby principle is, well, in fact, presented by Alexander, and that's his first book. It's Man's Supreme Inheritance, and this was written in 1910. I'm using the 1918 edition, but that paragraph was exactly written in the same way in the 1910 edition, before all the changes Alexander produced on that book. The orthodox teaching method holds the end in view and not the means whereby. It depends, that is, the orthodox teaching method depends upon the giving of orders on the endgaining principle. Such an order, for instance, as swing up and down again in the same orbit. Alexander was talking about a golfer, but there are many orders in the same idea, like maintain the torso in one piece, or direct the shoulder blade away from one another, without consideration of the means whereby, that is, without making certain that the pupil has the power to maintain a proper position of his spine and back, and to use the limbs correctly during the performance of such physical acts. So this explains why I have taken example of the shoulder position, the shoulder placement, or as we will see, what we want is a shoulder readjustment. And you will see that you can conceive the readjustment either of the shoulder or a readjustment of the movements which make the position of the shoulder. And it's a completely different approach. I consider that one is the end gaining view, and the other one is the means whereby view. The means whereby for the position, right or wrong position of the shoulder are about the movement that place the shoulder relatively to the other parts, and which obviously direct the other parts also in relation to the shoulder. So I have taken images from this film where you will see a senior Alexander. Here you can't see his head. He's called Wilfred Barlow. He was the husband of Alexander's niece, Marjorie Barlow, and they both started a school. Alexander didn't give them leave to start the school. They had to wait until he was dead, which tells something, or maybe not. And so during this lesson, we see a young lady. We are made to believe that it's her first lesson. Well, I tend to doubt it, but the lesson, most of the lesson, well, 2/3 of the lesson is given with the pupil lying down on her back. And just to say that I never teach in this way. I never teach lying down. I do not consider that lying down is, well, a proper situation to learn how to coordinate movements. And it's very interesting, of course, for placing parts or thinking of parts. But, well, it's obvious that in these conditions, the parts of the torso are fixed. And there is one thing that is quite interesting is that due to his training course, you can see that the tie that Mr. Barlow is wearing is, well, nicely vertical. I wouldn't say that the lower part of the sternum is protruding forward off the top of the torso, which means that there is a certain configuration of the back. I will come back to that later. So he's wearing a very vertical front. And if you look at how the person is disposed on the table, you will find that because the top ribs, the first rib, is much smaller than the middle ribs, you will find that necessarily with such little book behind the head, the sternum is inclined backward at the top. The person is unduly lifting the top of the chest, and therefore the cervical spine is pulled back by the thoracic spine. So for me, this is from the start a very, very wrong adjustment of the upper torso relatively to the middle torso. The person is not, there is an expression, levitating, that is an expression of one student of Alexander called Brown. And I do think that this person is certainly not levitating with the upper torso. So the neck is pulled back. And as a result, the larynx is not disposed correctly relatively to the mouth. Yet this is not the subject. The subject is different. We are going to see. I have transcribed. This is a transcription of the talk. You can find the recording on YouTube. There is a YouTube recording called the Alexandra Technique. There is a mistake in the typing, and if you look for the Alexandra technique, I think you are going to find it immediately. If you cannot, you can always stop the video and look at the well, the address, the HTTPS address of that video. So this is what Wilfred Barlow is saying while he's presenting the Alexandra technique. Now I'm going to work on a right shoulder. In the scheme of direction, as we call them, there's always an anatomical and a functional bit. When she learns to think the anatomical part, our attention goes to that part, like her knee or a thumb or a foot or whatever. So when I get her to think of shoulder, her attention is on the shoulder. We want the front of the shoulder not to hook forward like that, but to uncurl back. So when Wilfred Barlow is talking, the young lady is just reclining, just lying down, looking at the ceiling. But he's talking to her and to the camera. And so he's requesting the pupil to think of the anatomical part. And when he says our attention goes to that part, like her knee, a thumb, or a foot, or whatever, he's touching the different parts with his hands. Like making a direct sensory impression on the person. So the person is feeling his hands touching whatever, a knee, a thumb, or a foot. And it's obvious that he's directing her to think of the part and to think of the feeling she's having of these parts. You will find that there is no idea of coordinations of movements. Well, in fact, there is. She is not requesting the pupil to think about the movement of the shoulder, a movement of the knee, a movement of the thumb. No, he's requesting her to think of the parts themselves. You must ask yourself what the pupil can think about this, what the pupil can make of it. Yeah. My idea is that because I've been there, I've been receiving end of these kind of lessons. Well, you are feeling parts, and you are told that the part is not placed correctly, and it should be placed differently. And so you can talk to the parts. You can imagine anything. You can start daydreaming about a part placed correctly, but the means whereby to place the parts are just evasive. They are just very, very bizarre, you know. Once you understand the technique, the parts will be placed correctly. So I have prepared just a little moment where Wilfred Barlow is explaining that the shoulders of that pupil are not positioned correctly, and they should be repositioned. So you will see what happens.
That shoulder to drop down.
He's holding the shoulder blade, and he's saying, I'm going to coax that shoulder in its natural position there. And it's important to understand that when that is happening, it's like a second, 2 seconds, if you want. And there is a definite direction of movement for the shoulder, as you will see. And it's quite easy to observe. So I've made a little diagram to show this is the end of the readjustment of the right shoulder. And as you can see, I have measured the left shoulder. This is the reference, the one that is on the table, and the one that is just worked with. And we see that, of course, the shoulder has been moved away from the head, but also has been moved down relatively to the rib cage and the sternum. And while moving the rib cage down relatively to the sternum, it's obvious that there is, well, a connecting bone between the sternum and the shoulder blade. And that connecting bone is the clavicle bone. And the clavicle bone, articulated with the top of the sternum, has been rotated. So the movement is not only down, but the movement is also outwards. So when Alexander says we want to widen the upper part of the arm away from one another to support the torso, this is written in constructive conscious control of the individual, is clearly stating a fact. You can see that this upper part of the arm, it's the top of the humerus bone, the bone of the upper arm. The upper part of the arm is much closer to the sternum on the left side. There are, you know, if you look at the grid, there has been a marked change. And now we can see that the right arm has moved markedly relatively to the long axis of the torso. It's a fact. So a widening of the upper arm away from the central axis of the body has been, well, obtained. So I'm not in any way contradicting Wilfred Barlow on this. It's absolutely clear that there has been a readjustment, and I would consider a correct readjustment by the touch teacher upon the receiving student. Where I see a difficulty is that if the movement of the shoulder blade has resulted in the widening of the upper part of the arm away from the central axis, therefore it must be clear that the movement of the rib cage must be directed in opposite direction. Otherwise, if there is no table supporting and fixating the torso of the pupil, what is the assurance that when directing the movement of the shoulder down, well, the rib cage is not going to be inclined to the right with it? We know that the pupil has a habit of coordination, which make the shoulder and the torso very tight together. If the torso and shoulders are very tight together, to start with, any movement of the shoulder is going to be impressed on the movement of the mechanism of the torso. And if you try to go, for example, let's say you start with, it's obvious for people that that are used to it, but you will see that Wilfred Barlow is using his thumb just below, well, the moving bone. And the moving bone that we see is the clavicle. So he's making sure that the moving bone is going downward at its extremity, but it's not going downward, and his thumb is there for it to make sure that the sternum is not pulled down when the shoulder is pulled down. He must more or less know that the danger exists, and the danger is really there. I've seen so many people trying to move the shoulder and with being incapable of directing the movement of the other extremity, the movement of the top of the sternum and the movement of the rib cage with it, that I well know that it is what he's doing. So look at it again. Is really as if pushing the thumb up while the shoulder is going down. Of course, if the center of the torso was going down at the same time, you would never get this type of adjustment between the shoulder and the torso. So there is much that is not said, because he says that when touching the top of the shoulder blade, he can coax the shoulder into its normal position. He says, this is exact word that he's using. Now I am touching. You can't see, but you will be able to feel it. A very prominent bone on the top of the shoulder blade. And by touching that, I can coax that shoulder to drop down into its natural position there, and the arm to widen. And he's stating the end. So we have now almost lost the collarbone, and the neck is beginning to lengthen out of her trunk. There are a few things that you need to have in mind here. Is saying that by touching a part, it can coax that part to drop into its natural position. This is a very strange way of putting things, because it's not by touching the top of the shoulder that he's made the shoulder drop down or move outward into a more widened position. No. He's really organized a center of rotation with his thumb, and he's really created a combination of movements which make the shoulder rotate relatively to the torso, making sure that the torso does not follow the movement or collapses with it. So saying that by touching, he can coax that shoulder to drop into its natural position there is a very strange idea. It's like there is some magic going on there. While in fact, when I observe his movements, there is no magic. There is the exact opposite. There is a certain knowledge. I can't understand why Mr. Barlow is not, in fact, explaining where is the center of rotation, where is the moving part, where should be the opposing movement for that coordination to happen. Because I can tell you, if you rotate simply the shoulder blade around the top of the sternum without any, other consideration, you will find that you do not get that widening of the upper part of the arm. The widening of the upper part of the arm is not something simple. It requires a coordination of movements. And so saying that the pupil, by having had this concrete experience, is going to be able to let the shoulders drop down into their natural position is just plainly impossible. It's just plainly, to me, it sounds more like a lie. He's suddenly saying that releasing is going to take care of a complex coordination of movements. It's not a lie, it's engaining. It's the engaining idea that the person is going to be able, by feeling alone, to direct the movement of the parts in the correct position, as long as the person has had that adjustment repeated time and time again on his own organism. It's not the case. So Alexander, if you remember in your last lesson, he said that it will be found that the pupil is quite unable to analyze his own actions. Well, here, it sounds as if it's the teacher that is quite unable to analyze his own action. It's possible that Wilfred Barlow believes that by repeating that concrete experience, the pupil is going to let the shoulder drop, when there was no dropping in his performance. First of all, there can be no dropping, because down, that is toward the pelvis, is not, is horizontal in this case. And when you look at the movement of the whole shoulder, you will see that the heads tend to follow. Well, it's logic, because we know that the main muscle of the neck are attached to the shoulder and to the head. So it's obvious that when he's readjusting, he's not holding the head, because the head is resting on the table. And that's the only way he can get that dramatic change in the position of the shoulder relatively to the head. When the person is going to stand or to sit somewhere, how can he be sure that the pupil is capable of directing the movement of the head and the movement of the torso against the new movement of the shoulder? Well, everything tells you that this is not going to work. And I've never seen it to work, by the way. So we see that there are difficulties. Touching makes the pupil feel the part. Touching does not indicate a movement. So touching does not indicate a coordination for me. Maybe that the teacher is capable of feeling a coordination. I doubt it really much, but well, in that you can imagine whatever you want, but the pupil certainly not. The pupil is resting there, and what the pupil is feeling is the pressure of the table against the back, the pressure of the table against the head, and the pupil is feeling that the arm is moved. How is the pupil to imagine that to obtain that adjustment, she would need instructions of coordination on the means whereby principle? I can't imagine. So Alexander is very clear. He says the use of any specific part, such as the arm or leg, involves of necessity bringing into action the different psychophysical mechanism of the organism, this concerted activity bringing about the use of the specific part. Take the shoulder. The use of the shoulder involves of necessity bringing into action the different psychophysical mechanism of the organism, this concerted activity bringing about the use of the specific part. That is, the use of the shoulder is brought about by the concerted activity of the supporting rib cage, of the attached neck and head, and of the shoulder blade and arm. All these movements together will make the new organization of the shoulder blade relatively to the torso. So when you look at the changes that have been made on the readjusted part, you see just a position. This is the end result. I agree with the end result shown by the Dr. Barlow. I totally disagree with the idea that such a complex readjustment could happen by itself when the pupil is going to be, well, drilled into the repetition of adjustment day after days. Doesn't work. It's not true. So I have shown on these 6 images, starting from the first right down to the 6th, what the readjustment is about. It's clear that at first we have a certain direction of the clavicle bone, and we can see that there is a distance. Wilfred Barlow has placed his arm upon the extremity of the shoulder blade, the top of the shoulder, and we see the distance that there is between the headrest and his knuckles. And as he's performing this movement of rotation, maintaining, it's obvious that he's maintaining the top of the sternum at the same position, the same starting position. And as you can see, the more he works, the more he is in fact rotating that bone that is now no more directed as it was on the first image, is really created a geometric adjustment. A geometric rotation around a fixed bone. And so the natural position, what is natural in the new position, is a very good question. You know, I know that natural sounds good, and it's good to use that word in our speeches. What is natural there? The position has nothing natural, in the sense that the position is just the result of a completely new coordination of movements, in which, in fact, in that event, the rib cage is blocked on the table, the head is blocked on the headrest, and therefore the pupil cannot be conscious of the different movements that coordinate together to place that position. This is totally unnatural. The resulting position is just a construction. It's quite useful to maybe show to somebody that it's possible to obtain a geometric widening of the upper torso, a widening of the upper part of the arm away from one another. I agree with it totally. But as to teaching a person to coordinate the movements of the different parts of the torso with the movement of the shoulder, never. No way. So, according to the first end-gaining conception, all that is necessary when an end is desired is to proceed to employ the different parts of the organism in the manner which our feeling dictates as necessary for the carrying out of the movements required for gaining the end, irrespective of any harmful effect due to misuse of the self during the process. This conception implies the subordination of the thinking and reasoning self to the vagaries of the instinctive guidance and control of the self in carrying out the activities necessary to achieve the end. But it cannot be clearer. You have this idea that the correct position of the shoulder is the result of carrying out activities. These talks that we have at the moment have all the same title, Learning to Do. Learning to do in carrying out the activities necessary to achieve the expansion of the mechanism of the torso. And so we see that I do not. The other day, I had a new student, and she had so many lessons with first-generation teachers, and she said to me, I came to have lessons with you because you maintain or you say that you're teaching the initial Alexander technique. And I said to her, no, but don't misunderstand me or misunderstand what this is all about. I do not teach at all like the first generation teachers. Initial Alexander technique does not mean teaching like the first generation teachers. It means going back to the books and going back to the source and trying to make sense of what Alexander is saying about learning to do, learning to carry out activities at the same time. I mean, learning coordination. So learning coordination is about analyzing actions. We want to analyze the actions. How is the person going to really, by following verbal intentions, which we call directions, how the person is going to be able to coordinate the essential activities for lengthening and widening the back. That is the point. And so the first thing, of course, when you're using instruction is well, clearly delineated by Alexander. In other words, the teacher should first discover if the pupil is reasonably correctly coordinated in those muscular uses of his organism, which are essential to the proper carrying out of instruction necessary to the performance of definite physical acts, demanding coordination in the use of the human body and limbs. Well, when the teacher is going to start teaching, at least the teacher of conscious guidance, the first thing is that he will discover that the pupil is not reasonably correctly coordinated in those muscular uses of his organism, which are the movements mechanism, which are essential to the proper carrying out of instruction. As soon as the pupil is going to start directing the shoulder in a certain direction, the teacher is going to discover that the pupil is absolutely incapable of directing the mechanism of the ribs, which is the middle and upper part of the torso, in the proper way in order to support the movement that is required with the shoulder. It's not a surprise. The person has come to learn something. So that is what is going to happen. So when I give a lesson, I am interested in the person widening the upper part of the arm away from one another. Absolutely. but I want to explain and teach the person to understand what are the means whereby of that new adjustment of the shoulder relatively to the torso. And the means whereby are the movements. And to guide the movements, the person needs guidelines. There is this expression that I like, that what Wilfred Barlow is using. He says coaxing the shoulder into its natural position. I had to look at the verb coax because, well, it's not often used in geometrical movements. It's more used in the way as to, well, take somebody for a fool and making the person do something that she does not want to do or does not know how to do. In fact, there is a very geometrical idea in coaxing, is that you want the person the part, you want the part to be moved deliberately and very precisely relative to external landmarks. And that is exactly what I'm going to show you now, how I teach conscious guidance and control. We are going to start with this idea of shoulder blade. So here is a student. So the student is standing in front of a chair. We want to establish exactly where the student is. And in front of the student, as you can see, there is a wall that is very close. When the pupil starts, we can see that, of course, there is a middle torso protruding at the front, but there is also a shoulder blade protruding at the back. That's the person's habitual way of standing. So the person is obviously creating some movements. And when we say that the middle torso is protruding and that the shoulder blade is protruding, it's not really relative to the head that I'm presenting these defects. It's relatively to the ankle. In the Man Supreme Inheritance, Alexander say it all starts at the ankle. And so I observe that sentence and I say, what does it mean it all starts at the ankle? Well, when you say that you have a middle torso protruding, it has to be protruding relatively to something. I agree that it is protruding relatively to the head. When the person is in this coordination of movements of the different parts of the torso, the shoulder blade are pulling the upper torso backward relatively to the ankle. Therefore, well, the upper thoracic spine is pulled back and the neck is back. The person is like standing with a straight neck after having so many Alexander technique lessons. It's quite, well, normal. It's quite logical when the person has, in fact, been taught into that kind of adjustment. Yeah, in this image, if you were to place it vertically, you would find that exact same placement. The, of course, rib cage is forward of the ankle, and of course, the neck is backward relatively to the rib cage. So the person is arched. It's exactly, well, the same disposition, but in standing. The difference is that we now want the pupil to become aware of the movements which are creating this position. This is why I ask the pupil to hold a stick. We call that a ruler. It's just a wooden stick. And so the person is holding the stick, and I requested the person to touch the wall with the end of the stick. Why would I do that? Well, it's just that we are starting to discuss the coordination of the upper part of the arm and shoulder blade. The upper part of the arm is articulated with the shoulder blade. And I said to the pupil, it could be interesting to organize the movement of the shoulder blade relatively to the ankle. What do that mean? It's a strange way of talking, yeah? When we discuss this, we tell the pupil that looking from the side, it seems that the front of the shoulder is forward of the ankle, vertical, when the person is using the arm and directing the hand forward. Otherwise, this habitual way of standing is associated with the shoulder pulled back, and because the upper torso is pulled back anyway relatively to the middle torso. You must understand that you have to have a middle torso protruding in that way. It's absolutely necessary to pull the upper torso quite far back, arching the spine. Yeah. And so arching the spine this way means arching the rib cage, top relatively to the lower part of the rib cage. Therefore, the shoulder position is habitually behind the line of the ankle. And we say, it could be interesting for you to learn to direct the shoulder blade so that it's forward of the ankle. We are not discussing the placement for the moment of the shoulder blade relatively to the ribs, relatively to the sternum or to the head. No, for the moment, we start with a very general idea where the movement of the shoulder has to be directed relatively to a landmark that is very far away. But there is sense in that, is that we can exactly explain that when the shoulder is staying forward of that ankle, there is a special arrangement that we call poise. It's obvious that the more you get your shoulder backward relatively to your ankle, the more you're out of equilibrium physically. So the person is starting to imagine that it's possible to direct the movement of the shoulder relatively to the ankle. And for the moment, we are using a psychophysical tool, which is the capacity of the person to remember that we want the stick to be against the wall. I'm going to request the person to reorganize the movement of the rib cage relatively to the ankle and relatively to the shoulder blade. We are back into the readjustment of the shoulder blade relatively to the torso. But it's a completely different idea of having a person lying down and having a person subjected to his habitual sense of equilibrium. And so when I'm showing these movements, it's absolutely necessary for the pupil to have an idea of what is involved in this organization or coordination of movements. So I have already prepared the pupil and showed the pupil a certain number of images where we have discussed very simple concepts. You see a skeleton standing, and you see that the frontal part of the skeleton is set on the frontal part of the instep. Everything starts at the ankle, and it's all related to the ankle. So when we discuss moving the parts, we discuss moving the parts in equilibrium relatively to the floor, relatively to the vertical of gravity, if you want. And so I discussed with the pupil and I said, it could be very interesting to see whether what is represented by these diagrams is possible. You see on these diagrams, the shoulder blade is, the tip of the shoulder blade is set in the front of the ankle when the person is standing and when the person is sitting. So we imagine there is a transition from standing to sitting, and we reason out that poise would be when the direction of the shoulder blade relatively to the rib cage is such that the shoulder blade can stay in front of the ankle at all times. So this brings us to a possibility of imagining a middle phase where from standing you would go to sitting by first, of course, getting the sitting bones above the chair. Well, of course, everybody knows that we sit on a chair that is at our back. We have to go back to sit down. So what is requested of the pupil is to understand that, okay, we want to go back, but we have to organize the going back so that we maintain a certain relationship between the shoulder blade and the front of the ankle. Therefore, we have to change the relationship between the shoulder blade and the rib cage object, obviously. So the person is, for the moment, shown diagrams. It's a theory There is nothing practical in this. It's just we are discussing ideas. We say, could it be possible to maintain the shoulder blade in front of the ankle? How could we make sure that we can perform that experiment? Well, we can use a tool. We can have, as I show here. Yeah, that's it. It's working now. The person has more chance of maintaining the shoulder blade in front of the ankle if, well, the person has an intention that is really concrete and clear. I'm going to get, well, the hand and the elbow forward of the torso. So that's why the person is using that ruler for the moment. That's one reason. And so I request and to explore a new theory to perform the sitting gesture in a completely new way. I mean, something that is totally different from what the pupil is used to. And so there is one simple detail, is that when you go from standing into monkey, we are going to have the shoulder direction of movement organized relatively to the ankle, but also to the knee. Most people, when they go to sit, the first thing they do is that they release the ankle and their knees are coming forward. They don't even know they are doing that. It's happening. You know, they would not say they are doing it. It's part of the series of movements that are happening when they go to sit. So I want the person to become conscious of that. I want to show the person your knees are going forward. Your knees are going forward away from the chair. You're releasing the ankle right now. Why? Why are you giving that order? And the person will answer, I'm not giving that order. I'm not giving any order. I'm just trying to sit without losing my balance at the moment. Well, your sense of equilibrium is certainly active at the moment and making you do things, but could you follow a reason strategy? Could you say, well, is it possible to not release the ankle when going into sitting? Well, the reason is simple, is that when the person is releasing the ankle straight away and the knees are moving forward, we can see that the person has no way to maintain the orientation of the shoulder blade relatively to the torso. When the person is going forward with the knees straight away, what we see is that, of course, the middle torso is going forward, and there is no way the shoulder blade can be directed forward and outward to obtain the adjustment that we saw Wilford Barlow perform with his own hands on the immobile pupil, well, immobilized on the table. So it's a completely different thing. Now it's the real life, and the person has to organize the readjustment of the shoulder blade while going to sit. So we ask again to the person, do you think it's possible to just, like go into monkey with a completely new use of the knee? Alexander alludes to that in constructive conscious control of the individual. He talks about the new use of the knee. And it may be not what I'm showing, but it's certain that going into monkey without releasing the ankle is a new use of the knee. And especially because we have a person that has had many Alexander technique lessons. And so we see that when the person is trying to maintain the knee and maintain the shoulders in their position, well, there are all sorts of difficulty coming. So let's see. The person is requested to go into monkey, and the idea is to bring the sitting bone above the chair. It makes sense because to sit, you have to have your sitting bones above the chair. It doesn't really make sense to release the ankle straight away, because when you release the ankle straight away, your knees are going forward, but the pelvis too. And the sitting bone, instead of going toward the chair, going forward. So it's a strange preparation for going to sit, to move the sitting bone forward. So therefore, the person is asked to move the sitting bone back. And when he moves the sitting bones back, there is something curious that is happening. So in this case, the new movement that is requested is to move the sitting bones back and the iliac back. And we see I have drawn what I call a rib cage object. and I've requested the pupil to feel the side of the rib cage and to touch the lowest ribs on the side of the torso. During the first attempts at going into monkey, we see that, well, the person has real difficulty going back, but he's starting to go back. We see that the movement going back is with the lower sacrum spot. This is a spot I've requested the pupil to feel with his hands, but we are not interested in the spot he's felt. We are interested in his movement. And we are interested in his movements relatively, of course, to the ankle, and as I've said, relatively to the shoulder blade, because the shoulder blade is maintained forward by the hand touching the wall. But we are also interested of the movement of that movement to the movement of the lower rib cage. Because to maintain the new relationship between the shoulder blade, it's not only necessary to direct the upper torso, but also the middle torso. We see that when the person is trying to go into monkey, the person is directing the movement of the lower rib cage forward, and therefore the person is arching the back even more. So Alexander was right to say, when you ask the person to perform a correct coordination, at first you must make sure that the person is capable of organizing the different parts of the torso. In this case, it's obviously not the case, but the pupil must know it. The pupil must be told, and the pupil must be made to see what are the movements that is really performing. And therefore, you see, this is the same attempt, and the person is really trying to get the lower sacrum backward in order to get the sitting bones above the chair. And we see that there is a massive shortening of the back. The person is really trying to get the sitting bones back, but at the expense of the rotation of the rib cage. The rib cage is rotating in the wrong direction, completely wrong direction. The front of the pelvis, the iliac, are going back and down. The lower rib cage is going forward and upward. The person is arching the back even more. It's necessary for that person to see these movements and see this exaggeration. It's the first reaction that the person will have when confronted with the instruction to get the upper torso forward, and of course, to get, the back. So at first, upper torso forward and back, an instruction that was used all the time in the first training course, we see it brings absolutely wrong organization of the movements of the parts. And this is where we are going to start using conscious guidance. I asked the person to use the thumb and index finger to touch the two spots we've discussed, the lowest ribs on the side of the torso, and of course, the front of the pelvis. So we have the lower part of the rib cage object and the front part of course, the lower torso object. And so now I'm going to ask the person, in your habitual way, what is the movements, or what are the movements of these different parts? What we would like these two movements to be directed in the same direction. We wouldn't like one to go forward and the other back. We want these two movements to go back. We understand they are going back relatively to the ankle and relatively to the shoulder. The person starts to have a clear representations of the movements we are talking about. It's not stop shortening the back, or it's not think up. I don't use that type of instructions. They are gaining instructions. We are starting to use means whereby instruction. Means whereby instruction, where the person is going to know where is the shoulder, where the shoulder is directed, where the shoulder movement is directed, where the lower rib cage movement is directed, and where the iliac. So the person can immediately start to observe in leaning forward, because in order to get the sitting bone back, the person is like leaning forward. In leaning forward, I will ask the person, in your habitual leaning forward, what are the movements? Which movement, which part is going back first? Are they the same thing going back? Are they both going back? And the person will discover that when he's trying to lean and get, of course, the sitting bone backward relatively to the ankle, the person is in fact going forward with the lower rib cage. He never knew he directed that movement forward. So if we want to change the readjustment of the shoulder blade relatively to the upper torso, it's absolutely necessary for the person to start, realizing that every single time is straightening up. You see, the person was in fact trying to bend, and I say, well, that's it, fine. You have told me which movement was going forward, which movement was going back. We now see that you're going back with iliac, all right, but that you're not going back at all with the lower rib cage. This is not what we want. So could you please now stand again? And when the person stands, it's possible to see exactly what are the movements. We can see that the superior part of the knee is going forward. We know it, we can measure it because we see the distance from the knee to the wall, and we see that in bending, the knees have stayed in place, while when the person goes to stand, the knees are going forward and the shoulders blade are going back. There is no way to widen the upper part of the arm away from one another if these two movements are always organized in this way. The person has to change the coordination of movements because the standing position is the result of the coordination of these wrong movements. So we start to establish now ways so that when the person starts to understand it, this is the same lesson. So the person maintains the shoulder blade directed forward, and while the rib cage is going back, the rib cage and shoulder blades are going to be stabilized by their opposite movements. There is no table to stabilize the shoulders or to stabilize the rib cage here. No, it's the intentions of movement of the person. And so we see that the person starts to be able to reduce the curve. Instead of increasing the curves at every try, the person is in fact reducing the curve. And we are going to discuss the direction that I call back, going back with the back. It's important for the pupil to understand that when you use the direction forward, back, upward, downward, we have a technical meaning in mind. It's very important for the pupil to understand that what we mean by back is a direction that is perpendicular to the frontal plane of the torso. Most people imagine that back is back regard to the vertical of the wall. This is the back you would use when you construct a house, a fixed house. When you start dealing with a complex mechanism that can, in fact, be mobile, articulated, you need to understand that back. And so, for example, I'm asking him to direct the lowest ribs backward, and I'm asking him to show with the ruler where he's back. And he's trying to make the direction. And it's seen that his back is not exactly perpendicular. It's too low. It's necessary for him to understand and reconnect with this geometrical idea. In order to lengthen the back, you have three movements that are three activities that are absolutely necessary. One is to get the shoulder blades and the upper torso forward. The other one is to get the lower sacrum forward with the lower torso. And the other one is to get, of course, the rib cage object, lower part, to move backward. But backward is indicated by 90 degrees to the frontal plane of the torso. When I define the frontal plane of the torso with the pupil, we take the two iliac spot, the anterior superior iliac crest that the person can feel, and the lower sternum or the upper sternum, it doesn't matter. We create a triangle, and we want, seen from the side, we want the ruler to be 90 degrees to the triangle. At the moment, the direction of the movement of the lowest ribs is slightly too low. It's back, but it's slow. So we are going to see whether the pupil can compute these ideas. And apparently, yes, the pupil can direct what we call backward with the lowest ribs on the side of the torso. And as the shoulder blades are maintained forward and as the knees, well, the pupil is not able yet to keep the knees back. The pupil has already released the knees, as you can see, because in order to get the back, it's necessary to get the lower back direction forward. And at the moment, the person cannot direct the lower sacrum forward without releasing the knees. It's just a step in his coordination, his conscious coordination. It's not possible on this image, but it's, well, just later on, the pupil is able to reorganize his thinking, reorganize his intentions. Now that you understand what we mean by directing the center of the torso opposite to the direction of the lower part and upper part of the torso, well, could you please inhibit the release of the ankle? And therefore, we will see that more and more, the pupil is going to understand what we mean by upper torso forward, back, yes, and of course, knees directed backward. The more the pupil is working, the more the pupil understands. And this understanding is translated into the concrete action that the person is doing. I request the pupil nearly not to touch the wall, not to have the ruler touching the wall, so that more and more we are directed toward the conscious conception where there are no feelings associated. Well, it's not exactly true, because at the moment the pupil is using the feeling of the leg against the chair to make sure that he does not release the ankle. And the person is starting to establish as a fact this idea that it's possible to maintain the shoulder relatively to the ankle, relatively to the knees, and lengthen the back in going into monkey. I can tell you it's a completely new experience for that person. That organization of the shoulder blade has never happened before. Well, I say it has never happened before because I do not recognize that every time he was on the table with a teacher pulling his shoulder out of his torso, he had a conscious understanding what was necessary in order to get that organization of the shoulder blade relatively to the torso. There are many things you can work with when, for example, using that simple idea of going from standing to sitting or sitting to standing. And every time we are, for example, look, we have a perfect lengthening back here, and I request the pupil to stand, of course. And so when the pupil stands, despite what we've been doing, you will find that the pupil reorganized the old same movement of the shoulder blade relatively to the torso. So the pupil has now landmarks to go into monkey, but not to go from monkey to sitting. It's another lesson. It's another difficulty that the pupil can now learn to lengthen his back while going into monkey. As yet, the pupil is not capable of lengthening. So, well, it's a nice thing that now the pupil is able suddenly to, in fact, find his bearings, find his directions when going into monkey. It's already clear that the pupil is clearly able to obtain the adjustments of the shoulder blade relatively to the torso when the torso is directed in the proper way. So it's back to what Alexander was saying. He said, let the whole body come forward until the center of gravity fall over the feet. So you want to have the center of gravity falling above the feet. Yeah, you have to balance the weight at the top of the torso with the weight at the lower part of the torso relatively to the ankle, relatively to the feet. And you have to find that kind of performance while lengthening the back and readjusting the mechanism of the shoulder relatively to the rib cage movement. And so this is, well, readjusting according to the means whereby conception. This is not according to the engaining conception. We are not directing for obtaining the end by some sort of magical means, like trusting to the new feeling sense that has been reeducated. It's clearly a conscious direction of the movements of the part, a conscious direction of the activities, all the activities necessary to obtain the readjustment of a single part. That's it.
That's a good demonstration that when Alexander or we say conscious coordination, that the conscious part refers to reasoning. It's not like you showed where Wilfred Barlow is getting the pupil to feel the parts. So they're feeling an experience, they're having sensations and feelings associated with the sensations. When you start talking about directing movements, it opens up a whole new realm of investigation where you can start looking at the movements and deciding which movements how the movements of the different parts relate to one another and what other movements you could do, and then you can start experimenting. This is what he means by conscious coordination. It's not about feeling the sensations around specific parts more and more deeply until suddenly everything just takes care of itself. It's completely different. And what you've showed there is when you start doing this, you can analyze all these things and you can start making new decisions. You're not just at the mercy of the teacher's hands.
Yes. It's very important to understand that teaching is about the pupil being capable of readjusting the parts. And there is no other way to readjust the part than to readjust the movements that make the position of the parts. So all this business of feeling parts is irrelevant, and it's not irrelevant, it's also dangerous for the pupil, because the more the pupil is going to feel
feeling
parts, the less the pupil can organize movement relatively to external landmarks.
So in your view, then the guidance by feeling is the same as end gaining?
Yes, exactly. Well, it's not my view. It's my view of what Alexander is writing. Yeah.
But like the view in the modern Alexander technique tends to be end gaining is just doing something without first stopping and then giving your directions.
Yes, but we have the complete misunderstanding comes around the idea of directions. The directions are some sort of a mystical activity that you can have in your mind to change the parts. For me, this has no reality. For me, this is
and you can discover this for yourself using the video.
Yes.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
yes,
for everyone watching.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Jeando. I'm just saying, everyone watching, you will find a link to Jeando's website and his email address underneath, so you can go and book a lesson with him, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Yeah, thank you.